Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Day 2.
Woo! Yes, I've had 2 quarters of a croissant and I'm ready to go.
Ooh,
I guess that makes it
good.
a half a croissant. I'm not very good at maths.
Croissants are hard to divide by anyway.
They are, yeah.
It's exciting to be here. We'd like to start once again by acknowledging that we are on Ngunnawal Ngambri land. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across what we now call Australia have been custodians of and wouldn't have any concept of sustainability or climate change because we know that Indigenous knowledge and culture, it's very embedded in caring for country and all that means. So thank you so much. We want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathering and, of course, pay our respects to Ngunnawal and Ngambri elders past and present. We hope you managed to chat to the new Assistant Minister for Climate and Energy this morning, Josh Wilson, over in the gallery. You got to meet the Minister, didn't you?
Got to meet the Minister. He said he loved my work and I said, I hope to like your work. And he stopped smiling at that point.
Very good, very good. It's going to be a great day. We're going to talk about cooperation, enhancing our climate efforts, and one announcement. If you've got a pen, write this down. This is a very important one. Just like to make it known that these aren't pajamas. This is just what conference high fashion looks like. Jared Huntley from ACT Government got the assignment with the pink suit there. So.
And you'll be auctioning this off a little bit later on for climate change?
I don't think you can afford it, frankly.
Okay, very good. All right. Yesterday was all about the local and kind of what was happening in the local government level and how that kind of shifted what was happening at the state level and the federal level. But today is about how Australia fits in the global perspective and the global climate movement. So this is a really fun day of big thinking and I can't wait to get stuck into it. But before we do that, I just want to thank our wonderful sponsors here, the CSIRO, ACT Government, ANU, JT Productions, and of course, the custodians currently of this amazing building, the National Film and Sound Archive. It is such a beautiful building. It's the kind of building that you can imagine Meriton would like to knock down and put up some apartments in, wouldn't you? You can just feel the leaky showers around you. It's such a spectacular building. Yeah.
Beautiful. We've got a great panel coming up now. So we will hear we'll hear keynotes and then we'll have a panel. The keynotes are Professor Frank Jotzo, Natalie Unterstell and Michael Battaglia, who'll share insights to Australia's role in accelerating clean energy across the Asian Pacific region. So to kick us off, our first speaker is Professor Frank Jotzo. He's Professor of Environment and Economics and Climate Change at ANU. He also serves as Head of Energy at the Australian Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. And he leads the Australian Government's carbon leakage, speaking of leakage, review, and advises New South Wales and Queensland state governments, as well as many other things. Read his bio. Professor Frank Jotzo, welcome to the stage.
Thank you, Frank.
Hey, good morning, colleagues. Good morning, friends. And first of all, a shout out to the conveners here. A wonderful program, really so diverse and inspiring. And so, look, want to start off the morning by saying a few things about Australia's renewable energy export-based future economic vision and what that means for international aspects. Really, is my theme here. So, what are we looking at? Net zero emissions globally. Right? This means huge change, obviously, in energy use. And with those changes in energy use come massive changes in energy production patterns and in energy trade as well, right? Very obviously. And that has the Middle East, of course, in particular, with some very, very grave concerns about what their economic future might look like and how they might reposition to that. And of course, same goes for any large fossil fuel producer and exporter in particular, because you would expect exports to be affected before domestic production in most places, fossil fuels we're talking. Now, what will come with that, if we take net zero globally seriously, is a big picture change in the economic geography of heavy industry. right? Because that's now globally largely arranged, not just along mining natural advantage, but also around energy availability, fossil fuel availability in particular. And the future clean energy system, you will be using largely renewable energy to process all of those commodities. And that, to a large extent, turns into a local game of using the energy where it is abundant. And that, of course, is at the heart of Australia's natural advantage on renewable energies for export markets. What do we need for that to happen? Well, first of all, a comprehensive push on policy. Okay, not just in Australia, but internationally. I'll come back to that. And we'll need a massive push on investment, right? And the investments needed to get to that new world of clean energy and clean industry, the unit of measurement is trillions of dollars, right? And that's not money that anyone has lying around. That is money that will need to be shaved off something else. Now, we will be building up reliable, clean, economically desirable, low running cost systems. But to get to that point, we will need to overcome a very significant hump in terms of putting those resources in, and something we'll have to give. And I think it will ultimately be private consumption that will have to give. That's where we'll need to find that 1%, 2%, 3% of GDP every year that will need to go into extra investment in clean energy and industrial systems. Now, Australia's natural advantage is clear, of course, in comparison with competitors that also have very large renewable energy resources. We've got a stable and open trade investment framework, but we have a high cost base, right? So fundamentally, that is how you might characterize it. What about commodities in question? Well, hydrogen, green hydrogen is really expected to be at the base of all of this. But let's stop thinking about liquid hydrogen on ships that sail to Japan and Germany or wherever. We're looking much more at a system where green hydrogen is produced in Australia and then turned into green ammonia, fertilizers, fuels, and so forth, and where green hydrogen is also used as a feedstock into various industrial processes, in particular iron ore processing, iron ore reduction, enabling a green iron industry in Australia. And that at the moment, and plausibly forever really, is seen as the largest opportunity for Australia in this game, because, we've got a very, very large export industry for iron ore, which faces significant risk of potentially being partly sidelined in the shift to green steel because of the nature of the iron ores involved, or that could turn into a massive engine for value added in processing with enormous energy inputs in Australia. So none of this is happening overnight, right? We used to envisage this low carbon industrial transition as mainly something for the 2040s. Perhaps 2030s. So let's not despair if we see this beginning at a sedate pace, or, well, not even sedate, but if we see it only beginning in the 2020s, okay? So overall, my assessment would be we're actually moving much faster than we would have expected just 5 years ago or so. Now, Australia can, of course, help the world decarbonize. We're currently exporting coal and gas, a little bit of oil, that amounts to about 4% of global combustion CO2 emissions, right? So much, much larger than our domestic emissions footprint. It is plausible that we'll turn this around and over time, in decades to come, be a kind of a contributor to emission savings globally by producing and exporting energy and energy-intensive goods that displace fossil fuel use elsewhere. Right, and of course we can imagine very large numbers. Our own numbers produced in scenarios at ANU peg this at maybe 7% of global emissions at a sort of a maxed out scenario. But even if we can in decades to come turn the corner and be a net negative emissions exporter, if you will, that would be a very significant achievement. A big question that I think we should be putting out is how can this actually benefit the country? Okay, because the basic economic vision is of course clear: replace fossil fuel exports with clean energy exports. But in this process, we will want to make sure that the economic rents, the profits, will actually be shared with the Australian community. And we will want to make sure that there is true benefit for indigenous communities, right? And so First Nations aspects are, of course, not a new thing at all in resource industries, but I guess we can hope and push for the emergence of new green industries being something of a reset or a chance for a new start in positive engagement and benefit sharing. It's more than engagement, it's benefit sharing with First Nations communities. Another aspect, the shifts in our export energy balance will not be reflected in our national emissions inventory and thereby will not be reflected in the achievement of our emissions targets. If anything, the establishment of large-scale renewable energy export industries will, at the margin, increase Australia's domestic emissions because all of this stuff needs to be built. Steel, concrete, and the reality is that some of these projects will likely start up with gas. Okay, and so we need to be conscious of that. And here's a thought, perhaps that's something that can be reflected in Australia's next NDC, right? Perhaps there could be a remark in there that explains this fact. We're a large fossil fuel exporter. We've got a genuine vision and commitment to actually turning that around and helping make a difference elsewhere that's not reflected in the headline 2035 target. Other things to be aware of, the list is long, but I'll focus on just a few. Competition for resources in the Australian economy, right? So building up a renewable energy export industry draws on very much the same things that we need in order to decarbonize the domestic electricity grid, for starters, right? Be it wind or solar equipment, be it trucks and cranes, be it skilled labor and engineers, be it planning capacity, be it social license for that matter, right? So we want to be aware of that. We need a massive expansion of all of these supply chains. And the more we do on exports, the greater the expansion will need to be. I'll finish on some thoughts on policy. So we're seeing the new age of green industry policy, I think we can say. And there's a sense that there's a rush. We need to be in this game. We need to get the foot in the door really quickly, but which door is it and which foot should we put forward, how far? So, and really, right, we need sound principles for this. We need robust frameworks of analysis and decision-making, and we need dispassionate and apolitical implementation of industry policy. Really important, and I would say really important for the next federal government in particular. There's a trap there in thinking that we need to support or should support anything that's green and that could be made in Australia, right? We will not be able to make everything in Australia, nor should we try to do so. And in deciding what we might want to do, we will want to keep in mind very firmly the concept of adjacency to existing comparative advantage, right? Work outwards from what we're already good at, right? And get good at new things, value added in resource processing, for example, right? Battery chemicals processing, not electric car making, right? To exemplify that starkly. Subsidies. Now, most policy approaches here and elsewhere in the world on green industries are focused on supply-side policies, right? Tax credits, different forms of subsidies, right? Make production cheaper, get production going. That's probably by and large the right approach at the start, but long term, for this to be sustainable, we need demand-side policies, right? We need sustainable demand for green commodities, for green ammonia, green fertilizer, green iron and steel, green aluminium, green cement, what have you. Now, the way to achieve that, the main route to achieve that is carbon pricing, of course, right? And as it pertains to exports, right, carbon pricing in other countries that's matched with border adjustments that reflect that domestic carbon price in an importing country to exporters, right? And that certainly would be the long-term vision of how you let a global green industry economy emerge, where traded green commodities are on equal footing with domestically produced commodities, and that would be a vision that would certainly be to the benefit of the Australian economy and arguably be the necessary underpinning of the emergence of that green energy superpower vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. That was really great, really insightful stuff. We saw the Chief Minister yesterday talk about all the achievements the ACT has done, and certainly in terms of incentivising on a consumer level. So that would be amazing to see those incentives on a much broader demand level. All right, our next speaker, Natalie Unterstell, is the president of the Talanoa think tank in Brazil, where she leads efforts to raise Brazil's climate ambition. A former climate negotiator and government leader, Natalie also chairs the Green Climate Fund's accreditation panel and was recognised as one of the 100 most influential women in climate by Apolitical. Natalie will provide insights on COP30 and COP31 and the role of the Green Climate Fund, and the importance of clean exports in transforming regional economies and the need for aligning with the 1.5 Paris Agreement target through ambitious NDCs. Natalie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Better Futures, for the invitation. And it's a great honor to be here today. You've been introduced to my professional background, but there's something personal that I want to add. I'm also a sailor. And something important that I learned as a sailor is the value of a good anchorage, right? I can't tell you how unsettling it is to wake up and realize that the currents have dragged your anchor. You are adrift with no idea where you are or where you're going, and it's a terrifying feeling. It's one also that the world simply cannot afford when it comes to climate action, right? Keeping 1.5 degrees alive is our political anchor for all climate action. And that's why my country, Brazil, is advocating strongly for Mission 1.5, together with the former and the current COP presidencies. We are, or our governments are, leading what's called the Troika, together with UAE and Azerbaijan. This combined geopolitical and diplomatic power of these three countries is aimed at getting the world to step up its commitments so that by the time we meet in Brazil next year for COP30, we can get back on track for 1.5 degrees. The stakes couldn't be higher, right? And while we don't know yet if Australia will host COP31, I have a strong feeling that it will, and I will be rooting for you. If so, I hope that the innovative approach of the Troika involving our governments can be continued next year with Australia and the Pacific Island nations on board. And maybe that is not only a troika of governments, but maybe a troika of civil societies too. So the history shows us that presidencies, COP presidencies, who find common ground and make the effort to achieve a successful COP, they are rewarded. France secured the historic Paris Agreement in 2015. Egypt championed the first loss and damage fund in 2022. And last year, the UAE, Dubai, took bold steps to move us beyond a future dependent on fossil fuels. These aren't just diplomatic victories. They are economic ones as well. Investments in clean energy are now outstripping those in fossil fuels, projected to reach 4.5 trillion annually by 2030. I think Frank just mentioned the trillions in investments. And these investments, they are the insurance policies we need because the loss and damage from climate disaster will otherwise become unbearable. So Australia may have a crucial role to play in ensuring that we don't drift away from the destination we've agreed upon as a global society, which is a 1.5 aligned future. In Australia, perhaps co-hosting or co-presiding COP31 with Pacific Island nations must help us to anchor a safe and just future in this arc to COP31. But here's the reality. 1.5 won't be achieved through domestic action alone. Even as we ramp up the investments at home and abroad, there's still an elephant in the room, one that's producing a lot of emissions, and that's global trade. It's not enough for us to tackle domestic mitigation and adaptation efforts. The global community, especially the global south, is expecting nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, that also address the global transition away from fossil fuels. And this is the advice that we are giving back home to Brazil, that our NDC, in order to be 1.5 aligned, it has to include domestic mitigation at the highest ambition, adaptation to the 1.5 degrees world, and also the transition away from fossil fuels. It's not easy because our current global trading system was built to promote open and competitive markets, but it wasn't built to curb emissions. When you account for the emissions embedded within traded goods, they represent about 25% of global emissions. If global trade were a country, it would be the second largest carbon polluter in the world, right after China. So I guess this is an important issue for Australia too, since most of your production is for export, right? So this brings us to a crucial point. The science is already clear. To keep 1.5 alive, we know there's no room for more coal mines or oil and gas fields. And yet many major fossil fuel producers, they are planning to increase production in the coming decades. That's the case of Brazil. This results in what we call the production gap, the gap between countries' planned fossil fuel production and what is consistent with the Paris Agreement goals. And the existing NDCs confirm this gap. As most major producers, they are explicitly stating that the fossil fuel production will continue or even increase. So if we are to be 1.5 consistent, the next round of NDCs due in February next year, especially the NDCs of fossil fuel producing countries, they must commit to a phase out. And at a minimum, this means a commitment to no new exploration licenses, for coal, gas, and oil, and a quantitative commitment to reduce or phase out fossil fuel production by a target date, with countries with the highest capacity to transition taking the lead. So Australia, along other global leaders, has the opportunity and the responsibility to ensure that our anchor holds firm. The world is watching, and together I think we can steer this Earth ship towards better futures. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And yeah, great reminder of the opportunity for accountability of Australia, if Australia and Pacific Islands are to co-host COP. Our next speaker is Michael Battaglia, who's mission lead for CSIRO's Towards Net Zero mission, working to support Australia's transition to net zero in hard-to-abate sectors. With over 2 decades of experience in agricultural innovation and carbon policy, Michael has played a leading role in advancing sustainable solutions for industry and communities. So Michael will share insights into how Australian industries can prosper in a low emissions world, focusing on innovation processes, regional benefits, and opportunities for exporting technology. And he'll highlight the importance of capturing these opportunities. Please welcome Michael.
Thank you, and thank you to the organisers for having us here. Look, given that we're in the National Film and Sound Archive, I thought I'd start with a film reference. So if Matt Damon, stuck on Mars with a potato and a clapped-out Mars rover, thought he had to science the shit out of things to solve the problem, well, we here stuck with a 20th century innovation system with the quintessential 21st century problem of climate change are not just going to have to science the shit out of this, we're going to have to innovate the shit out of this. And that's the story I want to tell you today around how, in addition to what Frank said around Australia capturing this opportunity and helping the world with renewable energies or embodied energy in manufactured goods, or as Natalie suggested, actually stepping up to the plate and helping drive the international agenda on these things. We also have a key role in creating the innovative infrastructure and the pathways to actually solve these problems. And it brings me back to Josh Wilson's talk this morning, for those of you who got to hear him, and it was quite good. But I thought the real zinger in his talk this morning was when he talked about not being trapped by stories of the past. And there's an opportunity here, and I think Frank alluded to a bit, for Australia to redefine its view of the future. We don't just have to think of ourselves as primary goods exporters into this future. We can think of ourselves differently. We can go back to this concept of the smart nation, old and tired and flogged out as it is, and actually reimagine ourselves into that pathway, as well as redefining the export industries we might have into the future. I think the other thing I want to start with here is that there's been a number of pathway documents come out quite recently that plot Australia's pathway to net zero in 2050 or even earlier. And I think they make it look easy, but it's not going to be easy. There's some really hard work to do here. And the Climate Change Authority pathway roadmap that came out last week or the week before sort of suggested that a lot of the heavy lifting might happen with extant technologies, rolling out our known capacities in renewables, maybe some of the known innovation for manufacturing sectors. But even that roadmap shows a large, with all its ambition and delivering those, a large residual component of emissions that are going to be hard to deal with. And more importantly, it talks to the fact that even to realise those technologies, we're going to need substantial social and market innovation to achieve those ends. So, and to go beyond those, we're going to need the next wave of technological innovation to deal with those residual emissions. So social innovation, a lot of the people in this room do it a lot. It's just essentially different ways of organising social structures to achieve societal needs. Market innovation is just different ways of organising or capturing value or setting up market structures to realise goods. Both of those are going to sit at the heart of our capacity to achieve the goals we want. We often talk about technological innovation. Matt Damon's science, the shit out of things. But a lot of what we have to do is going to be to capture those capacities we build, technological capacities we build into systems of use that deliver value for all of us. And we've heard some of that already in this conference. How can we drive energy efficiency to deal with housing inequity, energy inequity? How can we re-visualise energy systems so that they build local capacity and controller systems and generate wealth? I can't remember who it was. Someone you say was talking about payments for renewable infrastructure across properties, $20,000 a year, $20,000 per kilometre for those structures. Again, market innovation that'll overcome and allow us to build feasible systems of use around which we can achieve things. So I've gone off piste here, but it doesn't matter. The other thing that came out recently is the National Science Statement. Many of you might have glossed over when that came through, but for those of us working in science, research and innovation, it's a pretty important document. And it really did place science at the centre of the government's ambition in reshaping the Australian economy. And rightly so, because I think if we're going to meet this challenge, as I said, we're going to have to really deploy science in the service of society and embed science into collaborative structures to help us visualise the possible, set the boundaries to the possible. But importantly, we're going to have to democratise that science and make it in the service of all of us here to actually make that an equally weighted conversation rather than one that's captured. So where am I up to here? So let's just sort of unpack what some of those dimensions look like. And I'll just give a couple of vignette stories around technological innovation, social innovation, market innovation, and where Australia might, in developing those structures, serve the broader region and the world beyond. So these are going to be critical capacities that we need for Australia to meet its NDC and develop a pathway to a prosperous, equitable society, but there are also contributions that we can make to the world. And so I'll, through these stories, talk a little bit about that. So Frank and others have talked a little bit about green steel. In fact, everyone in this conference has talked about green steel or green iron ore processing, and with good reason. Whilst it contributes only about 25 megatons of Australia's accountable emissions, if you look at it through the value chains we have, it's 60 times more than that into global emissions. And I think, Natalie talked about global traded goods and the consequences. We can contribute to the world by reducing our domestic emissions, accountable emissions, but the biggest thing we can deal with is actually work across those global supply chains to reduce those emissions. And some of you, if you were at the conference yesterday where Hamir and Philip are there, we were talking yesterday, one of Australia's really big problems, of course, is that most of our magnetite is the easy pathway because it allows you to go through green steel processes easily, but Australia mostly has goethite and hematite, which are really tricky and mean you have to go down different pathways. Some of our neighbours have similar resources. India, for example, has a lot of hematite, I think. Could be goethite. But what that means is the innovation we do in trying to build our industry, a green industry in the future, can actually help our neighbours in a similar way. And in fact, what we can do is set up these bilateral innovation partnerships. We have an Australia-India partnership that actually helps both Australia and our partners decarbonise these critical supply chains. Another situation, Australia is, of developed countries, very dependent on agriculture. We have a big agriculture industry, large agricultural exports. We have a lot of cows in this country, and those cows produce a lot of methane. And we've invested heavily, for example, in developing and starting to scale livestock feed supplements that can deal with that. And we're, again, in solving our problem, exporting those technologies to the world. So through those, and key to those is actually being conscious of the capacity for those innovations to be made available to others in plausible structures. Social innovation. So there's lots of social innovation going on, and people have talked about that a lot. But I think there's a really key opportunity here, and again, the Assistant Minister, Joss Wilson, talked about this morning, this crossover between adaptation and mitigation needs. And this is going to sit at the heart of what a lot of Australia needs to do. We are really exposed to climate change effects. We start with quite a variable climate. We start with a warm climate, and we start with an environment that's very cyclic and subject to extremes. Figuring out how we can start to build the energy systems of the future and build resilience into them and build into for community needs is something that we can model and demonstrate capacities for. I'm taken a bit by the story, and some of you may know it, of Cobargo, which was really badly hit by the 2019 and 2020 bushfires, and the town was largely destroyed. Power infrastructure was taken out. Most services were taken out for an extended period of time. The town had no power, which meant no sewage, no phones, no refrigeration, and they became very conscious of their vulnerability. At the time, they were looking at investing in renewable energy infrastructure, but they'd started to take, from a bottom-up community view, started to take a different view around how could they build that into an islandable local power system that could then meet their needs. And then started to think about local governance and ownership of that structure so that it could be made more suitable. Could the local residents start to identify where safe havens from heat could be? Could they start to look at local ownership to deliver benefits back? The last example I really want to give, given I've talked too long, is around market innovation. And Australia wants to build a sustainable aviation fuel industry, and there's a lot of supply-demand matching to occur. A contribution Australia can make to the world in that is by looking at how the international regulations around feedstocks are influenced by international regulations that look at land use and land use transitions. Australian agriculture has a very long and traditional history around rotational cropping that intercrops oil seeds like canola or even carinata with grain production. Other countries with poorer soils will also be looking at that as a way of sustaining agriculture and reducing fertiliser inputs, but it's not clear how that'll sit with international regulation around food versus fuel arguments. So there's an opportunity for Australia to make a contribution in that. So I just want to finish that Australia can make these contributions, and if we can help figure out how to build some of these concepts of social inclusion, resilience into the system, we'll be making globally significant contributions in the same way as we will through power and other contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Innovate the shit out of it. That's what we're going to do. I like it. I like it. Up next is a panel exploring about how government, industry and community leaders are working together to drive solutions to decarbonise economies. This panel will showcase the momentum behind capital deployment and stakeholder collaboration in accelerating the transition.
So moderating this panel is Emma Aisbett, who is an Associate Professor at ANU School of Law and an Associate Director of the ANU Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Initiative. With a background in chemical engineering, environmental change and economics, Emma's interdisciplinary expertise focuses on green industrial policy and trade-related climate policies, including embedded emissions accounting to support net zero trade.
Also joining Emma, Frank, Michael and Natalie are Rebecca Jinks, Director of ESG and Impact at Taronga Ventures. Alongside them all is also Simon Holmes, Director of Superpower Institute, the Smart Energy Council and the Australian Environmental Grant Makers Network, and the founder and convener of Climate 200, which definitely is not a political party. Definitely not a political party. Please welcome Emma.
Are we on? Yes, we are. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I am very honoured to be moderating such an all-star panel here, and I'm very excited about the conversation that they're going to share with you this morning. I would like to start by acknowledging at the start of this panel that we are, of course, on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land and to any Indigenous people who are with us today. So we've had some great sort of keynote presentations to set the scene, and we're going to build on that in this panel. And I think a couple of things have really come out of this discussion so far this morning. So Australia's big opportunity, the importance of understanding international trade, which I always love to hear people say, and of course the importance of innovation. So I'd like us, to take a moment and think we have seen exponential growth in investment related to the net zero transition in the last 5, maybe 10 years. So I'd like us to think about, how do we maintain that growth? Where do we need that growing investment to go? What does it need to be invested in? So physically, where does it need to go, but also in terms of what? And how do we sort of all work together across different stakeholder groups to help guide and direct that investment? So I might start with Rebecca. Morning, Rebecca. So you're an ESG and Sustainability Director at Taronga Ventures. You support ESG goals for a portfolio of companies and institutional investors, particularly in the real asset sector. If I understand real assets, that's things like buildings, is it?
Properties and bridges and infrastructure and anything that sort of falls under the banner of urbanisation.
Excellent, thank you. And so you are one of the people who likes to talk about innovation, so I'm very glad you're here today. You leverage technology and innovation to address ESG risks and seize sustainability opportunities. In fact, Taronga Ventures are about to release a piece assessing the importance of technology for the green transition and building on your previous work with Deloitte. So can you share with us how can technology support achieving a net zero carbon future? And what is the role for Australia in this technology world?
That is a huge question. But there's a lot that we have seen that technology can do. I have the privilege of leading our responsible investment practice. And so I get to look at a lot of really great emerging tech companies that are looking to solve for environmental and social challenges. And more often than not, these touch on climate tech and decarbonisation and net zero solutions. We see a lot of great companies that are coming out of not just Australia, but more broadly the Pacific, that are looking at storage and energy generation, electrification, driving efficiency to reduce demand, anything that supports with the green energy transition. We're definitely starting to see that IP and those solutions coming out of Australia and the Pacific. There's a lot of really great thinking that's going on in our universities, and one of the things that I love to do that I'm constantly trying to encourage our industry to look at is around taking that IP and supporting our brilliant minds to commercialize those solutions to help to solve for the global challenges that we have in the decarbonisation pathways that we're all working towards. And one of the biggest challenges for that is how do we globalize those solutions and not just keep them in Australia or keep them in the Asia Pacific region. And that's one of the things that we really love to do, and I really love to do, is to work with those innovation technologies as they're growing to make sure that they position themselves appropriately to solve those problems. And as I said, they sit across the whole remit and the whole life cycle of achieving a net zero target. And a lot of them are available today. We've got one really great company that I love to work with out of Dandenong in Victoria. And they started as a small events business. They were replacing plastic and wood frames that were disposed of after every single pop-up event with reusable steel and glass structures. And you know, they were doing events and that was great. And then COVID came along and Monash University and Sandringham Hospital Monash Hospital and Sandringham Hospital realised that they needed some space really immediately to respond to COVID. They needed safe places for their nurses and doctors to have tea. They needed additional space for triaging through the ED to respond to the pandemic. And Space Cube were able to pop up space within 12 hours. And they, you know, were able to identify that they could come from one industry into another industry. And now they're being used for resiliency responses where we see flooding challenges, where we need to be providing emergency housing across the country. So there's some really interesting ways to think about technology and innovation. That's a really basic, easy to understand solution that sits in the space. But I think that's all to say that Australia has a really great opportunity if we work with our universities, we work with the private markets, we work with groups like Taronga Ventures that are looking to invest in these technologies and facilitate their growth. As we heard, there's a huge opportunity for Australia and for our companies to export some amazing solutions and really drive towards achieving net zero.
Thanks so much. So innovation at every part of the cycle, including to help us adapt and scale. Fantastic. Simon, you hardly need introduction. You're an analyst, an investor in clean tech and clean energy, a philanthropist, and as we mentioned already, probably best known for your role founding the Climate 200. And last night you gave the 2024 Manning Clark Lecture and addressed the very broad topic of politics of the energy transition, a perennial issue in Australia, of course. What can you tell us about Australia's role in the global energy transition and about the politics needed to reach that potential?
Thank you very much for having me here. I won't recount the 45-minute speech, but I'll crunch it in very, very, very quickly. I think everyone in this room understands where we are, that Australia has been an incredibly lucky country, right? We have had series of booms, one after the other. We're starting with the gold rush and tin and copper and then wool and wheat and coal and uranium and gas. We have had this incredible bounty of natural resources. And where we sit right now, coal and gas are our exports number 2 and 3 and make up between them a quarter of our export revenue. Our big problem is that we have all of our major customers have pledged and are already making steps to reduce the use of those. So I made the point that Australia's facing a Kodak moment. Kodak, that used to be a phrase that they were very proud of. Kodak was really was in the memories business and in capturing the precious moments in life and letting us share them. They invented digital photography. They were there. They had an online image website in 1999. They were there at the beginning. They had everything in place to transition to be into the next world of memories. They beat Instagram to market by 11 years. But now you'd have to say, well, the year that Facebook bought Instagram was the year that Kodak filed for bankruptcy. A once great company that was there and had all the pieces to make the transition, just couldn't let go of its past. So I made that case that Australia is at that position right now. Another point that people pennies seem to drop is this notion we send phenomenal amounts of iron ore, that's our number 1 export, and large amounts of metallurgical coal. So we send the minerals and we send the energy overseas to process those minerals. Now, through an accident of physics, it's easy and cheap to send fossil fuels. The transport costs are in the noise. So it makes sense for us to send the energy and materials to the factories. But through that accident of physics, it's very expensive to move green energy internationally, which means that there will be an advantage for the factories to move to us. And it's an enduring advantage. We're not the only country with these advantages, but I think others at this conference will have spoken about that. Now, politics. We've all been conditioned not to talk about politics. We've got to move past that. Politics is the air we breathe. It's the operating system that enables the visions to be realised, everything that we're working towards. And we have a broken duopoly in Australia where the coalition is fixed on that Kodak moment. They cannot imagine, they deny this future. And while Labor accepts that future might be there, it's really only in first gear. It's not moving up rapidly through the gears like we need to if we want to capture that. So we need to put pressure on the political system. Richard Dennis has a quote: "There's 2 ways to get a politician to move, and that's pain and fear of pain." Right? It's very cynical. It's very cynical. Like, we can write lots of lovely reports saying here's the great opportunity, but until the politicians feel that they're, the power that they relish, until they feel that that's threatened, they're not going to grab these opportunities. So I'm imploring people, and we saw this at the last election. There were 20,000 volunteers. Climate 200 was a crowdfunding effort with 11,200 donors. We supported 23 candidates. 11 of them were elected. The 4 that were incumbent, 6 independents in the lower house, and David Pocock in the Senate. They are all applying pressure on the system. Thank you. So much credit to the communities that found those amazing candidates, and other communities are doing the same. And then I also made the case that we cannot be complacent. Nobody's got it in the bag to get re-elected. Everyone is going to have to run a really strong campaign, and that's going to require the help of tens of thousands of Australians to make that happen, but with more pressure, more politics, then the good ideas that have permeated this conference will be implemented. We just got to keep that pressure on.
Thanks, Simon. Yes. A good reminder that we get the government we deserve, so we all better get out there. I might mix things up a bit and turn to Natalie next. So you're president of the Talanoa think tank in Brazil, and you've been raising ambition and being a thought leader as well as a negotiator for years now. You've been recognised. Congratulations for your global influence. So once we've raised ambition, let's live in the dream world where we have raised ambition broadly. How do we meet it? What do we actually need to do? What are the elements that the international community is recommending in terms of transition away from fossil fuels, and what lessons can you share for Australia?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. First of all, I think we are now in this very right moment of elaborating the nationally determined contributions. Each country will decide its own, so there's no one size fits all. However, there are some features that I think are being discussed and kind of recommended to everyone. One being a very simple and basic, but so important, that the NDCs, they should be an expression of a country's ambition. And that means not only the national government ambition, right? But the subnational governments, the private sector, the civil society. So they should not be a government document, but actually like a state or a societal document, one that we can live up to. Right. So this is the first thing. Unfortunately, when national governments are responsible for making that happen, sometimes they are a little bit selfish and they decide that they are the ones that have the right to decide for everyone because they have been elected for it. So anyways, sometimes consultations are lacking. Decision-making is not based on the best science available. So anyways, the process is what I think it's so important, and I hope that here in Australia you will have the chance of shaping this outcome. We are fighting hard back home because our government is still a little bit like, I don't know if they're going to open consultations or not. But anyways, I hope you get a chance of shaping that, and that your NDC, which is due in February next year, becomes a good expression of the climate ambition that I'm seeing here in the Better Futures Forum, by the way. And then there's something that I mentioned before, which is that we know very well that we will not secure a safe future, a 1.5 aligned future, if we tackle only the domestic emissions, right? Anywhere, here, Brazil, anywhere in the world. So, of course, these NDC needs to be a good expression of our climate ambition involving your national emissions, your domestic emissions, but you have to go beyond that. And all countries, including yours, including mine, they agreed back in November or December last year in Dubai that we would transition away from fossil fuels. So this is expected to be reflected in all NDCs right now. And it's very difficult because it shouldn't be just like a statement saying, we commit to transition away. You need more details. And in many countries, I don't think the policies and the conversations around the transition away, considering the exports, considering the production, have matured. So I think this is a call for countries like mine and yours to mature this conversation, to advance this conversation. And then there are some specific elements that I think are useful. One is about the time frame. When are we transition away from coal, from gas, in our case, from oil, right? The time frame is important. We need to set up a date, or at least, an aspirational date for that to happen. We heard yesterday, I think it was in the dinner, we heard from the mayor of Canberra, the ACT governor, is that how you call? Sorry. He was saying how important it was to set a date for the transition here, right? And how that provided the predictability for the private sector, so on and so forth. That's the same story everywhere. In whatever country or local government decides and put up a specific date, that drives then long-term planning by the private sector. So I think timeframes are important. And then the other thing that governments normally don't like that much, but it's also extremely important, and I think all governments will be scrutinized next year in terms of their NDCs, is to be more transparent about the fossil fuel production plans. So this is another area. Again, I know it's not easy. We're dealing with that at home as well, but being more honest, totally honest, to be frank, regarding the plans to expand fossil fuels and how that connects with the plan scenarios and targets, I think is a must.
Thank you, Natalie. So targets and timeframes matter, and they should ideally be a whole of society choice. So, and this, I think, forum is all about that. Frank, my colleague here at the ANU, in my completely unbiased opinion, you're possibly Australia's leading climate and energy policy researcher. You provide your expertise to both federal and state governments, as well as NGOs and industry. And we've heard a lot about innovation. We've even heard universities mentioned a couple of times, which is very pleasing to hear. So perhaps you can give an example of your research and how it can help to inform some of those questions about where investment should go, what can guide private investors, and indeed how can research inform government design of green industrial policy supports.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you very much. And I'd just like to cycle back to something you said, Natalie, first. And I can really only say, I really hope that you have opportunity to discuss with our decision makers about this concept of an inclusive NDC that represents the country's ambition as distinct from representing any given government's view of how the next 10 years should unfold. I think it's actually really, really important. That's something worth for this entire community to push for, right? Not just the advocacy for a strong target, right? But the advocacy for an inclusive and true process of deliberation of defining the nation's ambition. Okay, so research. Look, at ANU, we've been fortunate to have a special initiative over the last 5 years or so called the Zero Carbon Energy for Asia Pacific Initiative, where, many of the ideas that are now expressed in the government's renewable energy superpower kind of label, helped emerge really in a research scene. Of course, there were think tanks involved, other universities and so forth. But really, the origin of this idea that Australia can prosper in a net zero world with the help of clean energy exports originates in the research sector. I think we can say that very clearly. Where are we at in terms of cutting edge research, right? So firstly, of course, technologies, right? There's a really big question over the different types of iron ores and their feasibility in different processes for processing into green steel, right? And you really can't overstate how important this is, right? So iron ore, our largest export, right? Imagine that falling away because of an incompatibility of future green technologies, right? Disaster. For WA to start with, but fiscally for the entire country, right? And compare that to the vision where, maybe iron ore exports remain at a similarly high level, and the value added is doubled, tripled, quadrupled through energy inputs, right? Fantastic. Okay, so that's a really big picture. There's technological questions to be solved, but there's increasingly also questions of economics, of policy, of supply chains, and geopolitics to solve, right? And so we're beginning to see apparent real interest in East Asian countries to outsource the energy intensive, relatively low value added part of the steel industry, right? So POSCO are quite open about their intent to actually, open a green steel plant, green iron plant somewhere in the world, export the green iron to Korea for further processing in the traditional steel industry, steel central, right? But where will that be, right? Will that be in the Middle East or will it be in the Pilbara, right? Then there's China, of course, right? By far the world's largest steel producer. Great overcapacity in traditional blast furnace, relatively young installations, right? How do we imagine a Chinese transition to green steel, right, which will involve the stranding of trillions and trillions of dollars of capital, right? How is that going to work, right? And how might China get to a point where China is able to accept an economically and environmentally optimal solution that may include the importation of green iron rather than keeping the entire value chain within China, right? And so that's one of the sort of, we try to look for the biggest, hardest nuts, and that's one of them.
Thanks so much, Frank. Michael, back to our topic of innovation. So, of course, you're mission lead for CSIRO's towards net zero emission, and focusing on these hard to abate sectors such as iron and steel. You talked about how innovation is a key means for Australia to capture opportunities, a common theme, which is great to see. So tell us, what 3 things would you like to see happen in the area of innovation in the relatively short term between now and 2030?
Yeah, thanks. And I think Frank may have just alluded to some, and I think the biggest problem for Australia's innovation system at the moment is it's deeply fragmented and siloed, and both policy framing's quite siloed, and then particularly our technological framing and other areas are deeply siloed. So and that's a legacy in some ways of a deeply neoliberal approach to research and a system that looked at specialisation and competitiveness in our research infrastructure. So if I was to look forward and I'd say that comment I made glibly about a 20th century innovation system and 21st century problem is really we need to frame these things differently. We need to start to look at how does Australia coordinate and cooperate to deal with these problems quickly. But, we have to, as Simon said, you have to work within the political reality to some extent. So I think what Australia needs is there's never going to be an overarching structure. We're not ever going to look like some of these governments that have research, industry and policy in lockstep. But I think Australia really could be served well from some backbone research orientation organisations that help us coordinate these various institutions that are really one of our deep competitive advantages, but at the moment aren't working together. I think if I was to go, the second thing is this, we've talked about technological innovation, but this stuff has to come in and drive social acceptance, deliver social value. And so I don't quite know what it looks like, but it's represented in this room by how do we build that collective capacity to imagine and shape the future together. And so that's the deeper democratisation of the pathway choices we have. And if I was to go, the third thing we have at the moment, we're somewhat wandering blindly into this future and making the changes to our system to try and tune it up for the future, which is great, and it's a necessary response to an urgent challenge, but you need to build reflective capacity into the system to start to understand what that's doing. What's it doing to the lowest 20% of the socioeconomic strata? What's it doing to other things we value? How are the choices we make about critical minerals going to start to impact on other values like biodiversity that we simultaneously want to progress? So I'd say the third thing we need to build in that innovation capacity is a deep collective monitoring and evaluation to understand how this is unfolding, to start to redirect our action or retrue our policy incentive frameworks and the governance capacity we build.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, that challenge of how do we move quickly without acting as a bulldozer to social and other environmental issues. And once again, working together dynamically. So I think thank you very much for your insightful but also concise interventions. We actually, I think, are back on track to have time for questions from the audience. So does anyone have... Oh, yes, excellent. We can see a few. All right, lots. I think the first hand I saw go up was next to Monica, the person in the white shirt.
Oh, thanks very much. I have a question for Simon, and that was, I was wondering if you could offer us any specifics from your experience about what is sufficient pain or fear of pain that does actually motivate a politician to move.
So simplistically, it's the threat of loss of a seat. But I've got to put a caveat on that. Part of my personal model of thinking about the last election was that every day the coalition is getting this constant push from News Corp to go further and further to the right, and further to denial. The narrative that Peter Credlin has on Sky News is that Morrison lost because he went too woke, right? Now they honestly say that, right? My theory of change was, well, I mean, they're obviously listening to this constant push. My theory of change was that they would be pushed back towards the centre by the results of the last election. I got to say, I failed totally with that theory of change, right? And that's a lot. One of the key things to remember is that the centre of gravity for the coalition has moved strongly to Queensland. Both the leader of Liberals and leader of the Nationals are both members of the Queensland LNP, the first time that's ever happened, and the majority of members in Parliament are. There are more members from the LNP than there are Liberals from Queensland and from New South Wales and Victoria put together. I think we're halfway through this step. They need to have a bit more pain before they're going to start moving back towards the centre. But I think that will eventually happen. I'm seeing Labor feel some pain in Western Sydney and seeing their rhetoric change when that happens. I think that's ultimately when an MP starts feeling that they might have to find a new job after the next election. That's when they start fighting really hard for what it is that they're feeling pain from.
Thanks, Simon. Yes, I think there was two hands that went up the back there. Do you want to decide amongst yourselves who goes first?
Industries in the Philippines have a pattern of displacing people who are like the urban poor communities and also indigenous communities. And one of those LNG companies actually are affecting Verde Islands, which is one of the vital ecosystems of the Coral Triangle. So how do you make sure that exporting clean energy is actually clean? Because if you're going to say clean just in terms of emissions, but it's polluted with a lot of activists, community organizers, indigenous leaders that have been taking care of those vital ecosystems. I mean, Coral Triangle is one of the ecosystems that the fisheries industry came from. It is really important for food security and food sovereignty of the whole world. So how do you make sure that those various segments of the value chain of this energy and exporting technologies doesn't involve or actually protect human rights and environmental rights and land rights of a lot of people and communities?
Excellent question. Thanks. Who would? Everyone? Does everyone want to turn to this one?
At this end of the panel, we're keen up. We're sorry. It's a little difficult to see you from here, so excuse the lack of eye contact. But look, there's some hard things here for the environment movement in particular, and for the part of the citizenry who is, rightfully, vitally concerned about environmental objectives in the board. There is no energy infrastructure that does not involve the deterioration of local environmental values. Okay? And the existing energy system that the world has is terrible in that regard, right? Oil wells, oil production and transport infrastructure, the gas infrastructure that you mean, that's before we get to coal mining and coal processing and coal burning and all of that, right? And, there will be adverse effects from renewable energy-based systems, in particular because of their scale and their land use involved, right? And when we get to clean molecular energy, hydrogen, green ammonia, and so forth, you're talking about large-scale industrial installations that look very similar to the petrochemical industry, right? That's the reality of it. Now, in that, right, there will be environmental values compromised and in some cases destroyed. Okay, let's be clear about that. Let's keep in mind that we're displacing systems that by and large compromise environmental integrity to a greater extent than the new systems will, right? And let's make sure we keep in mind that this change is absolutely needed in order to address climate change. There is no way around it, okay? And we want to minimize adverse impacts on local communities, on environmental values and so forth, but we will not be able to avoid them. Right. We will, however, need to make sure, and we can make sure, that benefits from these new industries can flow, including into government budgets, and that money is used for environmental purposes, for social purposes, overcompensate for the damage that you do through the establishment of those new industries.
I just had a few other things. We had a great conversation yesterday around the green metals transition, and a couple of things that are pretty key to go on from where Frank's gone are we really need to look at the processes by which we negotiate these things and make sure that we have free and informed consent among the communities and stakeholders who are engaged. But we need to go beyond that and make sure that as a nation we recognise we need to build the capacity of the various strata of citizenships and stakeholder groups to participate in those discussions in an informed way. And so there's this whole layer of recognising we're going into a much more complex, contested space. And, you know, whatever the historical legacy of past infrastructure build, change will start to impact on values, as Frank says, but we need to actually go into that with a citizenship that can actively engage in a free and fair way, and that with freely available information and ways to interrogate that information. And that's going to take active investment from government at all levels to build that capacity.
I might just quickly add to that. I think one of the questions that comes up there on a much broader scale is around labelling. So how do we confidently know that it's clean and responsible energy? And I think from a market view, that's something that we're definitely grappling with in the investment space as well. How do we know that this is a clean tech fund? How can we be confident that there's no adverse impacts that are happening? I had the privilege of doing some work recently with the UK government on the free trade agreement between Australia and the UK in terms of understanding adverse impacts of technology that's utilising that bilateral agreement, and is it clean tech? Should it benefit from the free trade agreement? Does it qualify? And there are structures in place and there are frameworks in place that can help us to identify those adverse impacts, to build up and articulate mitigation strategies if there are those negative impacts, and to clearly articulate and understand as a group and as a community what those impacts are, whether they're positive or negative. And I think the first step is always transparency, and that provides confidence in the labeling, so that if I am buying clean energy or I am investing in a clean tech fund, I have the confidence that that's been well thought through by whoever the manager or the provider is. And I think that's a really important part of this conversation that we need to work through as a group as well.
Music to my ears, certainly, yes. Role for governments in helping tame that wild west of certifications out there at the moment. Is the mic still up top?
Yeah.
In the interest of that efficient, we might go to you and then up front.
Hi, my name's Ebony. I'm a Jabba Jabba Bardi woman. My mob is from Western Kimberley, so quite a way away from here. Grace touched on making sure we don't have sacrifice zones in Black and brown and poor communities. But a lot of what we yarn about, a lot of communities I've worked with, a lot of mob in my family and my friends, we've discussed how we don't want to see a transition from fossil fuel billionaires to renewable billionaires. We want we want community-led solutions. We want community ownership. We don't want a clean climate that doesn't also involve First Nations justice, social justice, and justice for our Black, brown, and poor communities. So we know that First Nations people have been displaced for decades because of mining corporations. We know that First Nations people are being displaced because they're the first people disproportionately experiencing the impacts of climate change. So how can you ensure that First Nations people here in so-called Australia and around the globe are being thought of first in these situations, in any form of climate justice, in any way to move to a clean, green, sustainable future? And how can you ensure that we aren't just going to see a transition from one energy form to another? How are you going to involve First Nations communities in this decision-making? Consent's well and good, but you've mentioned like consent with stakeholders. We don't want to just see stakeholders. We want to be shareholders. We've been having this conversation a lot over the past couple of weeks. We need to have ownership over renewable energy. So how are you ensuring that that's going to happen in this space?
An excellent question. Thank you so much. Did you want to, Brazil obviously has a lot of Indigenous people also intersecting with this energy system transition. Could you share?
Yeah, so first I think I want to endorse what you just said, many of the things that you said, starting with the fact that the transition shouldn't be only about replacing one source of energy with another. And certainly if we go only through that angle, we won't do what the type of transition we need. So it certainly involves the transition in mindsets, in modes of production, in jobs, so on and so forth. So first of all, I agree with that. And secondly, I heard something yesterday that I think applies well to this conversation, although I don't think it's a response. And I don't remember who said that, but anyway, someone said yesterday, look, First Nations community, they not only have the right to decide, to determine what happens in their territories, in your territories, but also they should be in the front line of the benefits, right? So I'm quoting someone, I don't remember who that was, but I found that brilliant because it's about protagonism, right? It's not only being consulted, not only, having the right to access the benefits, but also like being the protagonists. And back home, we're seeing a lot of protagonism. We now have a Minister of Indigenous Peoples for the first time, and we are seeing a lot of businesses developed, including on energy, on wind energy being developed. And what we want to share with you all in the COP30 is precisely that there are new models being tried out. Many of them are being successful. And I'm sure that can be, or it is possibly the reality here in Australia too.
Thanks, Natalie. Simon.
I hear the concerns, and I absolutely agree. It's got to be a priority. It's not just energy, right? It's our form of capitalism, our form of democracy has to evolve, has to evolve quickly for these concerns. There are I'm seeing some bright sparks or encouraging developments. One I'm aware of is a project called the Western Green Energy Hub, which is down in the southeast of Western Australia, right near the Nullarbor. A massive proposed project which would be geared towards green exports, probably green ammonia, but it's not that far from the main grid, so maybe it'll contribute to Australia's electricity as well. In that project, right from the start, they've been working in partnership with the traditional owners. I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the nation or the traditional owners that they're working with, but right from the start, the community will be shareholders in the project, and it's there's a model in infrastructure, build, own, operate, and transfer, which we see in, say, the toll roads industry, which after 30 or 40 years, that infrastructure reverts back to the community. Well, this is exactly how that project is being developed. If the community chooses to, they will have the choice all the way along. But if they choose at the end of the sort of concession period, the project will revert to traditional ownership for the entire project. So people are developing models like that, and there's very different discussions for these mega renewables projects than we saw for the mega resource projects a generation ago.
Thanks, Simon. I think we have time for one very short question and possibly one very short answer.
Do we still need a carbon tax, or will the market and NDCs take its place?
Well, a price on emissions helps the market sort things out in the way that they should be sorted out. There's a very strong case for pricing emissions wherever that is practical. And of course, there are limitations on the feasibility of that in part arise from the politics that prevails in different jurisdictions of the world. And Australia is, of course, not alone in experiencing some of these painful aspects of politics.
I think the economists would say it's the most efficient way of reducing emissions to have a price on carbon. If we don't have one, then we end up having a whole suite of de facto prices on carbon. Not as efficient, we won't get there as quickly, but the political reality define which systems can be in place at whatever time.
If I may add a very simple line on that, if polluters don't pay for the pollution, we are paying for them.
All right, what a great note to end on. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for the excellent questions from the audience, and please join me in thanking our panelists.
Wonderful. So we're just about to head to morning tea for half an hour. That'll be in the gallery, and we'll have a few representatives out there from Renew Australia for All. They'll be ready to share firsthand how the launch of the Repowering Homes and Communities package was received at Parliament this morning. So keep an eye out for Richie, Lauren, and other members of the team. But following morning tea at 11, we'll have a split session. So over in the theaterette, which is down the hall in the foyer, we'll have a presentation from Catherine Trebek sharing insights into the wellbeing economy, and a discussion on planetary health equity, moderated by Sharon Friel, featuring experts Ian Dunlop, Sophie Lewis, and Fran Baum. So that will be in the theaterette.
Great. And then here in the ARC Cinema, Luke Menzel will have a chat with Bathan from Superpower Institute. And we'll also hear, we're very lucky to hear a pre-recorded message from Matt Keane. He sent us a little video, so we're going to be listening to that one and watching that one. Luke's going to be also moderating a panel on the Australia's energy sector pathways to Paris, looking at how different sectors are contributing to our national emissions reduction targets. And you won't want to miss insights from Heidi Lee, Jorge Chapa, Andrew Morgan, and Kate Andrews. So see you in half an hour in the theaterette or here.
See you there.